My name is Amelia, and I often wonder why no one tells you that happiness is loud only when it leaves. Before marriage, life felt gentle, like it moved at my pace. I woke up without dread, without calculating my worth for the day. I didn't measure my smiles or edit my thoughts. I simply existed, and that existence felt enough. At that time, I thought this feeling was normal, permanent even. I didn't know that one day I would look back at that version of myself with longing, as if she were someone I had lost forever. I was raised in a home where love didn't need explanations. My father, Robert, was the kind of man who spoke little but felt deeply. After my mother died, he became both strength and softness for my sister Lily and me. He never reminded us of what we lacked. Instead, he showed us what we still had. Our house was small, but it breathed warmth. The walls heard laughter more than arguments, and even when sadness visited, it never overstayed. Before marriage, I belonged somewhere without conditions, and I didn't know how rare that was. I was always dreaming. I dreamed through sketches, through colors, through rearranging spaces until they felt alive. Interior design wasn't just my profession, it was my language. When I designed a room, I imagined the people who would breathe inside it, heal inside it, love inside it. My father used to stand quietly behind me while I worked, never interrupting, just watching. Lily teased me endlessly, calling me the future famous designer, and I laughed because success didn't mean fame to me then. It meant freedom. It meant waking up excited rather than afraid. Before marriage, no one told me who I needed to become. When Daniel entered my life, he felt like a continuation of that freedom. He admired my independence, or at least he said he did. He listened to my dreams and spoke of partnership as if it were sacred. He made plans that included me without asking me to change. When he held my hand, I felt secure. When he spoke of marriage, I imagined companionship, warmth, shared silence. I believed marriage would protect the happiness I already had, not replace it. Looking back now, I realize how carefully love can disguise control in the beginning. Daniel proposed on a night that looked like a scene from a movie. Soft lights, smiling faces, applause. I cried because I felt chosen, because I believed I was stepping into a future built on mutual respect. My father hugged me afterward and whispered words I didn't understand at the time. He told me marriage should never cost me myself. I smiled and promised him I would always come home. I didn't know how heavy those words would become later. The wedding day arrived wrapped in beauty, white fabric, flowers, music, blessings. Everyone said I looked radiant, and maybe I was, or maybe I was just hopeful. As I walked out of my childhood home for the last time as a daughter instead of a wife, Lily clung to me and cried harder than I expected. I laughed and told her she was being dramatic, but inside, something tightened. I ignored it. I was taught that doubt before marriage was fear, not intuition. Marriage didn't change everything immediately. At first, it felt like learning a new rhythm. Daniel liked routines. He liked order. I told myself this was stability. He commented on my clothes, my habits, my schedule, and I told myself it was concern. I adjusted little things without realizing how much space those adjustments were taking. Before marriage, compromise felt like sharing. After marriage, it felt like shrinking. Daniel's mother, Margaret, became part of our daily life very quickly. Her presence filled the house in ways I didn't know how to escape. She believed a wife's value was measured by silence, obedience, and sacrifice. She corrected me constantly. How I cooked, how I cleaned, how I spoke. Daniel never stopped her. His silence taught me that my discomfort was expected. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a test I kept failing. I stopped designing late at night because Daniel said it distracted me from my responsibilities. I stopped meeting friends because he found them unnecessary. I stopped expressing opinions because they led to arguments. Piece by piece, I began erasing myself, convincing myself this was maturity. Before marriage, I felt alive. After marriage, I felt useful. And there is a painful difference between the two. Loneliness inside marriage is the quietest kind of suffering. You share a bed, but not thoughts. You share meals, but not feelings. You speak, but you are not heard. Daniel worked long hours and returned home tired and impatient. Conversations became instructions. Affection became rare. Appreciation disappeared. I began questioning myself constantly. Was I failing as a wife? Was I asking for too much? Was I too sensitive? I didn't realize I was slowly learning to doubt my own reality. When Lily visited, she looked at me the way people look at something fragile they don't know how to fix. She asked me if I was happy, and the word yes escaped my mouth automatically. But my eyes betrayed me. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I almost told her everything. Instead, I told her marriage was about adjustment. I repeated words I had heard so many times that they began to sound true. The night I truly broke was painfully ordinary. I burned dinner after a long, exhausting day. Daniel looked at me with annoyance instead of concern. His words were sharp, careless, dismissive. He didn't shout. He didn't insult me loudly. He simply spoke as if I were a disappointment, and something inside me finally collapsed. I locked myself in the bathroom and cried silently, staring at my reflection, trying to recognize the woman I had become. That was the night I realized love should never make you feel invisible. I went to my father's house weeks later. He opened the door and didn't ask questions. He didn't need answers. He just held me, and I cried the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years. That night, I slept without fear. The walls felt familiar. The silence felt safe, and for the first time since my marriage, I remembered what peace felt like. That visit planted a thought in my mind, a terrifying, liberating thought. What if survival didn't mean enduring? What if strength meant leaving? That thought followed me back to my marital home like a shadow I couldn't outrun. What if survival didn't mean enduring? The question terrified me because it suggested choice, and I had trained myself for years to believe I had none. Still, once the thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. I began noticing things I had normalized for too long. How my opinions were dismissed, how my silence was praised, how my exhaustion was ignored. I realized I was not living. I was managing discomfort. And the worst part was that I had started believing I deserved it. I tried to talk to Daniel after that visit. I chose my words carefully, the way one speaks when they are afraid of consequences. I told him I felt lonely, unheard, overwhelmed. He listened with impatience, his eyes drifting toward his phone, his body language already defensive. When I finished, he sighed and told me I was overthinking, that this was what marriage looked like, that I should be grateful. Gratitude, he said, as if pain and privilege could coexist so easily. That conversation ended with me apologizing for making things uncomfortable. I remember lying awake that night, realizing how deeply I had learned to betray myself. Days passed, heavy and colorless. I moved through routines like a ghost, performing tasks without presence. I cooked, cleaned, smiled when required. Inside, something was rotting. I stopped crying because tears required energy I no longer had. Instead, there was a constant ache in my chest, a quiet suffocation that followed me everywhere. I wondered how many women lived like this, convincing themselves that this was adulthood, that this was commitment, that this was love. Margaret's voice echoed constantly in the house, reminding me of what a wife should be. Daniel echoed her beliefs without repeating her words. They both believed endurance was virtue and silence was grace. I began to feel like an object passed between expectations, my humanity reduced to performance. Before marriage, I had opinions, preferences, dreams. After marriage, I had duties. One evening, Lily called me unexpectedly. I don't know what she heard in my voice, but she didn't let the conversation stay shallow. She asked me directly if I was safe. The word startled me. Safe. I realized that while Daniel had never physically hurt me, safety meant more than the absence of bruises. It meant emotional shelter, freedom of expression, dignity, and I had none of that. I told her I was tired. She understood what I couldn't say. Sometimes love hears what words refuse to speak. The following weeks were filled with quiet resistance. I began sketching again, secretly at first, like a forbidden act. I reclaimed small moments, listening to music with headphones, taking longer walks, breathing without permission. Each small act felt like rebellion. Guilt followed closely behind, but so did relief. I realized how starved I had been for autonomy. Before marriage, I had taken it for granted. after marriage, reclaiming it felt radical. Daniel noticed the change. He called it distance. He accused me of withdrawing. I wanted to tell him that you cannot withdraw from a place you were never fully allowed to exist in. Instead, I listened. I had become very good at listening. The breaking point didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with clarity. One night, Daniel told me I was no longer the woman he married. His words were meant to shame me back into submission. Instead, they freed me. I realized the woman he married was someone who slowly disappeared to keep peace. And I did not want to find her again. I packed a small bag that night. My hands shook, but my mind felt calm in a way it hadn't in years. I left a note, not angry, not accusatory, just honest. I wrote that I needed space to breathe, to think, to remember who I was. I didn't ask permission. That alone felt like a miracle. Returning to my father's house felt like stepping out of a storm. Robert didn't celebrate my return, nor did he mourn my marriage. He simply made space for me, the way he always had. He reminded me through his actions that love doesn't demand explanations. Lily stayed close, fiercely protective, shielding me from questions I wasn't ready to answer. The days that followed were confusing, relief mixed with fear. Freedom came with guilt. Society has a way of convincing women that endurance is nobility and leaving is failure. I heard whispers, saw judgment in eyes that didn't know my story. People spoke of adjustment, compromise, patience. No one spoke of erosion, loneliness, or emotional neglect. I learned quickly that pain is only acknowledged when it fits acceptable narratives. Daniel wanted reconciliation on his terms. He promised change without understanding. He wanted normalcy without accountability. Counseling felt like another stage where I was expected to perform gratitude. I realized then that healing cannot happen where harm is denied. So I chose separation, not because I hated him, but because I finally loved myself enough to stop disappearing. The aftermath was not easy. There were nights I doubted myself, mornings I feared the future. Independence is romanticized, but rebuilding yourself after emotional loss is exhausting. Still, every day away from that marriage felt lighter than every day inside it. I returned to my work fully, pouring myself into designs that reflected openness and light. Clients praised my intuition. I smiled genuinely again. I laughed loudly. I cried freely. I existed without apology. Slowly, I began to understand that before marriage, life felt beautiful because I belonged to myself. Marriage didn't ruin me. It revealed how easily women are taught to surrender themselves in the name of love. I stopped blaming myself for staying as long as I did. Survival is not weakness, it is instinct. Time softened the pain without erasing the lesson. I stopped resenting Daniel and his family. They were products of beliefs I refused to inherit. Forgiveness, I learned, does not require reconciliation. It requires release. I released the version of myself who thought love meant silence. I honored her endurance, but I did not return to her cage. Now, when I think about marriage, I don't see it as the enemy. I see it as a mirror. It reflects who you are allowed to be and who you are expected to erase. Love should feel like expansion, not confinement. Partnership should feel like safety, not performance. I am not afraid of love anymore, but I am no longer naive. I know now that the most dangerous thing a woman can lose is herself, and the bravest thing she can do is walk back toward her own voice. My story is not one of bitterness. It is one of awakening. Before marriage, life felt so beautiful. After marriage, I learned why. And now, standing in the life I rebuilt, I finally understand that beauty was never about being unmarried or married. It was about being whole. I am Amelia. I survived silence. I chose myself, and that choice saved my life. After I chose myself, life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became honest. There is a strange comfort in honesty, even when it hurts. I began waking up early, not because someone expected breakfast on the table, but because my mind felt lighter in the mornings. I would sit near the window with a cup of tea, watching the world wake up, and remind myself that I was allowed to take up space again. Some mornings were heavy with memories, others were filled with hope I didn't yet trust. Healing, I learned, is not a straight road. It bends, it loops back on itself, it pauses unexpectedly. But at least now, I was walking it willingly. People often assume that leaving a marriage means escaping pain, but no one talks about the grief that follows. I grieved the woman I thought I would become, the life I imagined, the promises that sounded real when spoken aloud. I grieved the years I spent convincing myself that endurance was love. Some nights I lay awake wondering if things could have been different, if I had spoken louder, earlier, braver. Then I reminded myself that love should never require you to beg for dignity. That realization didn't erase the sadness, but it gave it meaning. My father never pushed me to explain myself, but sometimes, late at night, he would sit beside me and talk about my mother. He told me how she laughed loudly, how she refused to shrink herself for anyone, how she believed love should feel like home. I realized then that I had been trying to honor marriage instead of honoring myself, forgetting that my mother had taught me to do the opposite. Those conversations felt like pieces of myself returning, memories stitching strength back into my bones. Lily stayed with me for a while, filling the house with her presence. She talked endlessly, intentionally, as if trying to drown out the silence I had lived in for so long. She reminded me of who I was before I learned to doubt myself. She showed me photos from years ago, pointing out how brightly my eyes used to shine. I cried looking at those images, not because I missed the past, but because I finally understood how much of myself I had lost without noticing. Work became my sanctuary again. Designing spaces felt like reclaiming my inner world. I created rooms filled with light, open windows, soft colors. Clients often told me my designs felt calming, healing even. I smiled quietly, knowing I was designing the spaces I once needed for myself. Every project felt like proof that I still had something to give, that my worth had never disappeared, only been buried under expectation. There were moments when doubt returned unexpectedly. A comment from a stranger, a question from a relative, a look filled with judgment could still make my chest tighten. Society is unforgiving to women who choose themselves loudly. I was asked why I couldn't adjust, why I gave up too easily, why I didn't try harder. I wanted to ask them how long a person should suffocate before it becomes acceptable to seek air. But I learned that not every question deserves an answer. Silence this time became my shield rather than my prison. Daniel reached out occasionally. His messages were polite, controlled, carefully worded. He spoke of missing stability, routine, familiarity. He never spoke of missing me. That clarity helped me release the last threads of guilt I carried. I wished him well, genuinely, but I no longer felt responsible for his comfort. Love without accountability is not love. It is convenience. Understanding that freed me more than anger ever could. As time passed, I noticed subtle changes within myself. I laughed without checking who was listening. I spoke my opinions without rehearsing them first. I rested without guilt. These were small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary. I realized how deeply women are conditioned to earn rest, earn love, earn peace. I stopped earning and started claiming. One evening, while organizing old boxes, I found my wedding album. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages slowly. I didn't feel anger. I felt compassion for the woman smiling in those photographs, unaware of what awaited her. She wasn't foolish. She was hopeful. I thanked her silently for surviving long enough for me to become this version of myself. Then I closed the album and put it away, not in shame, but in closure. People often talk about moving on as if it means forgetting. For me, moving on meant integrating the experience without letting it define me. I didn't want my story to become a warning filled with bitterness. I wanted it to become a reminder that self-worth should never be negotiable. Marriage should not feel like disappearance. Love should not demand silence. Slowly, I started speaking about my experience when women came to me quietly, cautiously, with eyes full of questions they were afraid to ask. I never told them what to do. I only told them what it felt like to choose myself. Some listened, some weren't ready. I understood both. Awakening happens in its own time. Awakening. There are still days when memories surface unexpectedly. A song, a smell, a familiar routine can bring back moments I thought I had outgrown. But those memories no longer hurt the way they used to. They remind me of how far I've come. They remind me that I survived something that once felt endless. Now, when I think about marriage, I no longer see it as a destination. I see it as a decision that must be made daily, consciously, equally. I know now that love should feel like support, not surveillance. It should feel like warmth, not weight. And if it doesn't, walking away is not destruction, it is preservation. Before marriage, life felt beautiful because I was aligned with myself. After marriage, I learned what misalignment costs. And now, in this quiet, hard earned peace, I finally understand that the most important relationship I will ever have is the one I maintain with my own soul. I am still Amelia, softer, stronger, wiser. I no longer fear losing love, I fear losing myself, and that fear protects me.